Hello, and welcome to our next presentation. On behalf of the MIT CDOIQ Virtual Symposium, we would like to thank all of our sponsors who have continued to support the symposium during this very challenging year. Before we thank our partners, we'd like to ask that sometime during the symposium's breaks that you visit our partners' virtual booths. You can also visit the Content Hub on the MIT CDOIQ website for some great partner resources. We'd like to thank the following partners: Deloitte, Informatica, Privacy Analytics, Nowak, Fusion Alliance, KPMG, Sandal Consultants, Tamer, Elation, Ali Data, Big ID, Boomi, Caserta, Citizen, Data Kitchen, Garage, Wakira, Pylog, Click, ThoughtSpot, Eckerson, Global IDs, Snowflake, Starburst. And as I said, please make every effort to visit our partners, use the virtual passport, because without them and our partner support, the symposium could not be held. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Tom Henry. I'm the Chief Data and Analytics Officer at Schnuck Markets in St. Louis, Missouri. I'll be moderating today's panel discussion on the topic of safely turning sensitive data into business potential. The panelists for today's discussion are Dr. Lynne Nowak, Dr. Joe Zabinski, and Mr. Luke Arbuckle. Before we get started, I would like each of our panelists to introduce themselves and give a brief overview of their area of responsibility. We'll start with Lynne.
Hi, hello, this is Lynne Nowak, as Tom said, and I lead our clinical data and provider solutions team for Express Scripts, and I have oversight for our advanced analytics team and data science.
All right, thank you. Joe?
Hello, I'm Joe Zabinski. I'm Director of Data Solutions at OM1, which is a healthcare technology company in Boston, and I'm responsible for our work in artificial intelligence, applications of data, and how those interact with patients and providers.
Great. And last but not least, Luke.
Hi, Luke Arbuckle, Chief Methodologist at Privacy Analytics. My role is to advise senior leadership in terms of protecting data.
All right, thank you. We should probably begin our discussion on safely turning sensitive data into business potential by defining sensitive data. Lynne, how do you define sensitive data?
Great question. I would start certainly within the healthcare industry. I think of sensitive data as a physician myself as the sensitive aspects of a patient's individual data. So something we would call their personal health information, PHI. And that's really going to be anything that is going to be confidential or identifiable about that individual patient, and certainly could cause, harm or damage or, consequences to an individual should that information get out into the public. But as a business perspective, there's also sensitive data that would really tie to either our internal business practices, certainly any kind of intellectual property or proprietary information about our business. And then third, I would categorize data about our clients or any sensitive information that could be harmful to our clients should that information get out, even up to and including who our clients are and with whom are we working, either as partnerships or as a vendor or really any kind of relationship we have with others in the industry. All of those things could be considered sensitive and potentially damaging if that information were to get out.
Okay, Luke, would you have any other insight there?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to build on what Lynne said in terms of confidentiality. Any data that's confidential is probably sensitive, right? Be it business practices or personal information. When I worked in government, we had a classification system for the level of confidentiality. At the lowest level was basically operational data for the day-to-day. That wasn't considered, if it was lost or stolen in some way, it wouldn't necessarily lead to any major embarrassment to the government, for example. And then there would be another level to go a little bit higher, which was also business operations. But in this case, it was considered that if this was learned or released in some way that it could do harm, or if it was attacked, let's say. And then on top of that, even a layer higher was when you start dealing with personal information. This is when it would get much more sensitive in the sense that it's about real people. And of course, if you're dealing with data of real people, there's a certain stewardship, responsibility about maintaining that data. I wouldn't discount all the other stuff as well, the IP and whatnot. That's all part of that confidential. But at least in government, personal information, has its own obligations, its own protections around that. But also, again, from an embarrassment factor, a trust factor, data about people was considered more sensitive, and it was expected, of course, that it was used properly and protected properly as well.
That's a great answer. I tend to bucket them into personal data that we need to protect on employees, on customers, other individuals, patients in this case, and then organizational data that is sensitive or a business asset to the organization. Sensitive data released on an individual violates privacy of the individual, right? Sensitive data released on an organization potentially releases trade secrets into the market that you wouldn't want released. Joe, in addition to personal data and PHI, what kinds of sensitive data should be considered business assets?
Yeah, it's a good question, and certainly a more and more important one as we get more access to data, and as we start learning how to do more and more things with it. I think the kind of division that you set up in your last comments between PHI, sort of individual information on the one hand, and then business organizational information on the other is a useful framing. But I think that there's actually a lot of interplay between those two and overlap between those two areas. Again, as I said, as more and more data are integrated into business decisions and processes, particularly if those data are used to inform analytic and AI methods, sometimes the understanding or sort of business data assets that come out of that process retain elements of the individual data elements that those pieces of information were derived from, but also have some of the business confidentiality components that are sort of more familiar in an IP sense. And so I think it's important to think holistically about how these categories of valuable business data blend into each other.
That's a great answer. I was thinking along the lines of kind of a binary, two buckets: organizational and personal. And those organizational assets being like organizational strategy documents, pricing strategies, very important, supplier and vendor agreements, innovation, IP, a lot of patents I know that Express Scripts has, and then of course financial data. But as I think about what you said, it really does, there is an interplay between the personal and the business data that create probably a stronger business asset at the end of the day. Lynne, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's a great topic, and really how that interplay between the patient or the personal health information, sensitive data, and how that intersects with the business data, the analytics assets, really how we use that data is really an interesting interplay, and how that creates a business asset for us. And one of the ways I think about it is the way we safely and securely use data and use the insights that we derive from the data, that in and of itself is a business asset. So the trust that we have from our patients, our doctors, our clients, and the trust that they instill in us to use that data safely and securely is in itself an asset. That they will be more willing to give us more data. They will trust the insights that we're deriving from the data, and they will want to partner with us. And really that's where we grow. So that really becomes a growth strategy in and of itself. And I think the sensitivity of some of the business assets of our clients and how we protect those, even in light of how we protect their data from other clients of ours. So if you think about the interesting dynamic of us having health plans as customers and also being owned by a health plan since we were acquired by Cigna. That trust that we have, that we will maintain the firewalls, that we will keep sensitive business data of our customers and our clients separate and distinct and secure from other clients, is in itself a business asset for us. So I think it's a really interesting interplay that's really all predicated on trust, that we can manage this data and use it safely, securely, and ethically in our business practices.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking along the lines of the personal health data, or that really being part of delivery of a lot of the business strategy, the development of those innovative solutions that help people from a healthcare standpoint. And then, of course, without individuals, you don't really have sales. So, you can't delineate the two. They do integrate and create value together as a combined corporate asset. Great. That segues nicely into my next question. I'll direct this at you, Luke, since you're already along this train of thought. Given we tend to think of sensitive data in terms of how it's mismanaged and the mismanagement may violate trust, how can we best define or articulate the value of sensitive data?
In terms of value, I mean, there are some academic work that looks at value in terms of the scarcity of the data, right? When we talk about, obviously there's information like IP and whatnot, but that is also scarce. It's within that organization. Personal data also is very scarce, right? It's not shared with everyone. That's what gives it part of its value. There's also obviously the relevance of the data. If you're going to calculate somehow the intrinsic value of the data, it has to be relevant to something, be it operational needs or process improvements or even innovation. Obviously, you have to determine whether or not you can use that data. Otherwise, it's not very helpful. And then, of course, there's a life expectancy. Data may only be good for a year, for example. It might be something very specific, and in a year's time, it's not really needed anymore. And that's part of that asset inventory that has to take place, to look at the data, determine its sensitivity, but you determine its value as well. But to kind of focus on that's sort of the academic, but I think it's practically speaking, I think everyone understands that, those sort of factors. But there's also the realized value as well. It's one thing to say this data has value, but we work with organizations, for example, that are often blocked in terms of using that data. They know it has value in some way, they have ideas, they want to innovate, but for whatever reason, it could be competing interests within an organization. We've seen that with big organizations. It could be that sometimes privacy is being used to block access because of those competing interests, or maybe it actually is an issue where there's concern there isn't a trustworthy system and way of sharing and using that data. So it's all well and good to have, it's like stocks, and you can have your stocks and see them go up and down, but until you actually sell that stock, it doesn't really have value yet, right? You have to be able to realize that value. So I think that's an important factor as well. And within that, going back to sort of the privacy aspect as well, it's how you're using that data. Like, what do you want to do with it? If it's what we call primary use, meaning I want to use that data just for the way it's been collected, that's fine. You want to increase, for example, performance metrics or operational efficiencies, versus I want to innovate with the data, which is a different class, and it has different needs and different regulatory burdens associated with that. So all those things have to be factored into that.
Yeah, Tom, I would add on.
Thank you.
I would add one of the key things we think of in value of the data that we have access to is around the timeliness of the data and the accessibility and quality of that data. So in healthcare, pharmacy is one of the quickest assets that we can get as far as the timeliness of a pharmacy and a prescription being adjudicated. So when we think about medical claims, there's often a lag in that data, whereas the pharmacy claims come in virtually real time. So the timeliness really adds value to what we know, when we know it, and then the cleanliness or the quality of that data. Usually pharmacy data is pretty discrete data elements, which makes it a little easier to use when it comes in. There's not as much translation that needs to happen. Those data elements are usually pretty clean. as opposed to, say, a PDF file or faxes where we may have access to that data, but it's not as usable in its raw form. So I would think those are things that we think of as adding value to that data.
Absolutely.
I could just
I'm
add,
thinking in the terms of business case, you know, that as you articulate that, that is a value creation for the patient in that particular situation. You got real-time information that could prevent a drug-to-drug interaction or some other bad effect, which would create value. You know, there's a business case, if you will, and maybe that's not the right term, but what are the cases for creating value at the patient level, or creating value at the business, or gaining market share level? That's how I think we need to start thinking of the value of data and articulating those value cases associated with sensitive data. Joe, you were going to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo something that Lynn was saying with respect to usability. I think there's an initial attitude with respect to a lot of data and how people consider it to be valuable to say more data is better, get it all in-house, we'll get some value out of it. But the cleanliness question and the usability question is enormous. And I think will become more enormous the more data is generated and the more people can do things with it. The one other point I wanted to make, and again, this is, I think, somewhat specific to healthcare, but is also seen in other fields, is there's more and more business value gained from synergistic effects between different types of data. In other words, you can have kind of a whole is greater than the sum of the parts effect. In healthcare, we see this a lot with, you know, for example, if you know something about the medications that a patient has taken, that's very useful in terms of understanding their health. If you know something about their genetics, that could also be useful theoretically in understanding their health. But putting those pieces of information together can give you the ability to say things that those pieces individually would not allow. And so this, as we think about value of sensitive data, I think thinking beyond kind of just isolated, you know, what's valuable about the pieces, but also is there additional value created by putting them in the same place is a really important thing to keep in mind.
And maybe this is more for you, Joe, is as you take these sensitive data sets and augment them with synergistic data sets, the value could be created in that machine learning, advanced analytic domain. What types of things are you seeing emerge from a value proposition standpoint in that arena?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say a couple things. First of all, the ability of artificial intelligence technology to take, everybody calls it big data, but you know, just amounts of data that can't really be well perceived by individual people, and see some of those patterns and interactions between different kinds of factors. There's real insight there that isn't apparent through traditional ways of looking at data. In healthcare, for example, it can give you the ability to say with much greater clarity kind of what's likely to happen to a patient years in the future, something that we just haven't been able to do. So, you know, the AI technology can unlock those kinds of insights, I think, quite a bit. The one other thing, you know, as we think about both those new opportunities and kind of what's important to protect in them from a business perspective, is those AI systems themselves kind of absorb or retain information from the data assets that those systems learn from, right? And those absorbed pieces of synthesized information are themselves data assets, which have their own kind of privacy and IP characteristics. So, you know, sometimes I think people will look at AI and they'll say, you know, let's build a model, and then we have a model. And that model kind of lives off on its own somewhere by itself. It has to interact dynamically with data to be most useful.
Yeah, I found, at least in my time working prior to Schnuck, so I was at Express Scripts, is the business context is so important in developing these models, which, you know, comes from, you know, generally, you know, the human side of business acumen, if you will. So augmenting what we're doing with the support of professionals in certain clinical areas in that particular example were highly valuable for us at Express Scripts. With that, Lynn, speaking of Express Scripts, how is sensitive data driving growth strategy at Express Scripts?
Well, great question. I would say we're looking at the data not only, as I think was mentioned earlier, the volume of data that we have access to, but focusing more and more on the power of what we can do with that data. And recognizing that over time, data elements themselves are going to become more and more commoditized. Doesn't make it easy to get to the data necessarily, but data is and will continue to be flowing much more seamlessly as patient access to data increases and payer-to-payer exchange of data increases. We're looking more and more at the analytics, the artificial intelligence, the machine learning capabilities that we have and that we're continuing to build on how we can really use that data most effectively to have the most effective and efficient engagement and interactions with our patients, with our physicians, with other pharmacies, even with other payers, and with our clients. And all of those different growth pillars on the ability to take better care of patients, lower the total cost of care in that patient's overall healthcare experience. That's of course what our clients are looking for us to help give high outcomes, good quality care, but also reducing the total cost of that care. All of that is heavily dependent on the analytics that we're able to do and how we're using those data assets to help serve our customers, our patients, and our doctors, which are all of our major growth platforms on really where we see future business going in different areas. And then also looking at the tools and the assets that we're building to create those analytics. How can those in and of themselves be business assets that could potentially be commercialized to our clients, particularly our health plan clients, that they also are looking to optimize the use of their data. So how could our data tools and assets that we've built potentially be used to enable them as well?
Great answer. Joe, Luke, anything to add to that?
So I guess I can jump in. Price Analytics is sort of in a different side. We're not a data collector. We provide technology and services to process data. So either we process the data on behalf of clients or we help them process data. So it's a little bit different, but at the same time, we need to use data as well. We need to use data to improve our methods, to improve our operations, our processing. So for us, in order to do that, we have to work on partnerships. We have to work with some of our bigger clients where we have longer term contracts and partnerships to deliver services or technology to them, and ensure that they're comfortable with us, working with them to improve those through the use of data. So improving our methods and whatnot, again, using that data that they're bringing us into the fold as part of the stewards of that data. And that sort of leads to what we do fundamentally is privacy engineering. So how can we help our organizations that we're working with, those partners, build trustworthy systems within their enterprises so that they can more easily flow data to either other organizations or within their own organization. Oftentimes we're working with large clients that are, for example, building data lakes, right? And we talked about data utility and quality, and that's really critical. A big part of what we do, oddly enough, because we're helping them to make the data non-identifiable, is we actually have to standardize a lot of data, do a lot of data cleaning, and have to do a lot of data standardization so that they can help pool that data. I mean, we come at it from the perspective of, how are we going to make it non-identifiable? But we always, we have to ask them, well, what is the end goal of your, why are you trying to create a data lake? And most oftentimes because they want to derive analytics from that data. It's a lot easier for them to do that if it's been harmonized, if the data has been brought together into a single location, it's been pooled. They can just, they don't have to deal with single individual data sets. We can actually standardize it some way. That helps. Another example would be sort of a hub and spoke type model where the organization we're working with has partnerships already. Could be with hospitals, could be with banks, et cetera. But they want to bring in data from a lot of those other partners. Same sort of rules apply, right? Again, if you can harmonize a lot of data, clean it up, and you can bring it together, that growth strategy for them is actually a growth strategy for us as well.
Okay, I would be remiss, and hopefully this applies. When we think about using sensitive data to drive a business growth strategy. We all have strategic pillars, and I would imagine each of us focus on customer or patient within that pillar, within one of the pillars. Obviously, we are doing a virtual meeting today because of the COVID-19 crisis and experience. How has sensitive data or other data sources come into play in meeting customer or patient needs in this COVID-19 experience? And this is a little bit of a deviation from that growth strategy, but it is important to our strategy to make our services relevant and abrasion free for our patients and clients, customers. So I'll toss that out there as just a question. Have your organizations had to use or pivoted to use some of this sensitive information to improve care, to improve the experience for customers during this time? And perhaps Joe, I'll ask you since we haven't asked you a question a bit.
Okay.
Is that relevant to OM1?
It is, and it's relevant in a couple of ways. I think the first thing that we started to see when COVID-19 really started to take hold and change, not just, obviously healthcare with respect to patients with the disease, but also with respect to everybody else, people who were delaying showing up for medical problems they had or putting off elective surgeries that they had scheduled. One of the, I think, most valuable abilities that data can provide us in this time has been just an understanding of what's going on in terms of the healthcare landscape. Usually, the first place to start in saying what's going on in healthcare today is sort of to say what went on a year ago, in terms of how many knee replacements did you have, or, what kinds of medication mixes did you have? Of course, things change, but you can usually rely on the past as a reasonable approximation of what's going on today. That has not been true for the last couple months since the beginning of really the impacts of COVID-19, at least here in the US. And so the ability of some of these data sources and ways of looking at data to show us kind of what's going on and to some extent what we can expect as different places shut down, lose capacity, regain capacity, open back up is one big area where this has been important. And I think the other one, and this is obviously more emergent, nobody has been able to draw really strong conclusions yet, but the ability to look at, in healthcare, we always call it real world data, data that's abstracted from real life patient experience rather than exclusively from, controlled clinical trial settings, and say what works, what doesn't work, what kinds of patterns do we see with respect to treatment, with respect to susceptibility. I mean, all of that insight is going to be derivable quite soon, I think, in ways that even 5 years ago there just wouldn't have been a breadth and a sort of synthesized ability to look at. And so I think we're not there yet as an industry with respect to seeing those really solid comprehensive insights about COVID, but that will come and it'll be useful.
Yeah, and to your point, we haven't seen history or haven't collected data on a pandemic. One hasn't happened in the lifetimes of the individuals on this call, but we can learn from this. Lynne, are there any learnings or things that Express Scripts is taking away from this experience beyond operating model and service to patients that you would want to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned earlier the timeliness of pharmacy data being so critical. And, it's been incredible working with our analytics teams that are really processing all of that pharmacy data coming in and all of those claims to be able to track in essentially real time, to Joe's point, what's going on and what drugs are being, we were able to see very, very early on increases in hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine and seeing those drugs and those upticks, and then we could use that to inform our supply chain. Okay, how are our stores? How is our access? So we could kind of inform our own business processes, but also then keep our clients informed as to what's going on in their populations. what prescriptions are being filled at a higher rate than we would normally expect, to Joe's point, given historical evidence this time of year, those kinds of things. A really, I think, a tangible example is that we published a paper about 2 months ago now, I guess, or about a month ago, on the state of mental health in the United States. This was a research project that had been going on for a few years, and we were getting ready to publish it. And we were able to, in very real time, do a quick analysis of the utilization of depression, anxiety, and insomnia medications, and how they had changed between February and March of 2020. So when we put that out, we were able to show that there was anywhere from a 20 to 30% increase in the use of anxiety, depression, and insomnia medications really since the COVID-19 pandemic hit the US, which I think really drove home, these are the things we need to be watching for in our patient populations. These are the things we need to really ramp up communications, ramp up access to care, keep an eye on people, really, reach out to those most vulnerable and most susceptible in our vulnerable patient population. And using that real-time nature of the data, not only could we see really where were the hot spots of COVID showing up, but what else was going on in our patients' lives outside of COVID that was being impacted by the crisis. Other things that have been pretty well talked about, things like decreases in hospitalizations for heart attacks and strokes, heart failure, things that are rather concerning as to why are we seeing a decrease in those other conditions, and trying to draw assumptions such as, are people fearful of going to the hospital, fearful of going to an emergency room, and instead they're home trying to stick these things out without seeking appropriate medical care at this time because of fear. And so we were then able to do interventions with those patients as well to make sure you're saying, if you're having chest pain, if you're having shortness of breath, if you're having neurologic symptoms, make sure you at a minimum call your doctor. But if you would otherwise call an ambulance or call 911, do that. Don't let the fear of coronavirus keep you from seeking appropriate medical treatment when you need it. So it's been very, very helpful to have those data assets that we could really do the analytics and get some real-time insights to how to change how we're engaging with our patients.
Yeah, a couple of things that both you and Joe said there are really interesting, gratifying. It tells you where we are or have come as an industry from an analytics standpoint, that you were able to pivot very quickly and gain these insights and take action on those insights. That's a testament to the companies you work for and this, the progress we've made in this analytics space. I know just anecdotally on the retail side, we were able to use our corporate data assets to ensure that we had proper social distancing within each store by only allowing a certain number of individuals into the store based on square footage at any given time. And we were able to very quickly pivot, understand, store space, occupancy rates, and so on, and create a better experience for the customers, but also a safer experience. And that's, and nowhere near the importance of, making sure that people that should be seeing a doctor for very serious conditions are seeing doctors, because we see in the data that they're not. That is just amazing. Luke, did you want to chime in there?
Sure. I was going to say that, it's testament a lot to the fact that trustworthy systems are being built. The fact that you can pivot and use that data quickly, and I think probably demonstrates the ability to use the data, is that you already have a system in place. We work with some large organizations that have built in very trusting systems, but also we work with pharma companies who are doing a lot of work now. There was something just published last week by Fuse about the transparency of clinical trials for COVID-19. We've partnered with Vivly in the same way to provide services free of charge to get as much clinical trial data as possible regarding COVID-19 out, available to researchers. I just read something, I think it was last week in The Economist, about how scientific publications are increasing by twofold every 14 days since COVID-19 struck, mostly because people are just getting as much information out as they can regarding what they're learning from the data, what they're seeing. And I think it's a testament to the field as a whole, trying to make sure we understand and we react as quickly as possible.
Oh, absolutely. We're sharing as an open community, protecting people's information as we do it. So yeah, that is something that I would say is a source of positive and pride for this community of data analysts and business professionals as we act on this data. One other area that we're all involved in that I would imagine has really come to the forefront is the analytics around supply chain, right? And each business has the need to make sure that their supply chain is sound and solid so that we can service the needs of our customers and patients during this time. I'm going to transition a little bit, still kind of along those lanes, that same train of thought. But Joe, when we think about data-driven enterprise, right? The discussion we just had indicates that we have a lot of data, we have good analysts, we are now training the enterprise to really consume, understand, and take action on data very quickly, right? So assuming that you've already made a pretty drastic change to OM1 and evolving to a data-driven enterprise, what steps did you take in getting there? And did you meet resistance? Do you how did you approach really moving towards that data-driven space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, OM1 is a digital healthcare company. So from the beginning, we've always had, I think, a somewhat mature attitude towards using data and analytics in a very flexible way. And a lot of the work that we do is helping others understand, how to get the most benefit from those kinds of technologies. I will say, especially within the past couple of months, there have needed to be some, some adjustments that have gone along with, the adjustment to fully remote work and so on that we've all experienced. But that have been around, can we answer questions that are different kinds of questions than we would typically be faced with, or can we, sort of to your point, can we get out, or to Luke's point, I think, to get out insights with a high premium on speed, even if that means, we have to sort of clean up some of the, the lingering academic questions a little bit later than we might in a standard, standard time. The one other thing where I've seen a shift to some extent in how we approach things, but much more so with a lot of the life sciences companies that we work with, is getting more mature in terms of business process in how to quickly use the outputs of pretty complex data analytics. I think that there's often a tendency when you've done a lot of work on understanding a data set, cleaning it up, analyzing it, to almost have a second round of long effort around using the outputs of that process. I guess that's kind of the best case. Sometimes all of that analysis goes on a shelf somewhere and nobody looks at it again. But saying sort of, we don't have the luxury of not paying attention to what we can see in data these days. I think that's beginning to clarify in a lot of industries kind of focused around healthcare now. And I think that'll be a good change if it persists, beyond the current crisis, just that adaptability and kind of willingness to interact with quick data outputs.
Lynne, you took a legacy company that has been around quite a while, obviously grown through acquisition. So there's a lot of different approaches to data and bringing data together to create or inform decisions. What types of steps did your organization take to begin informing other areas of the business outside yours with these data assets?
Yeah, great question. And as you mentioned, Express Scripts has grown by acquisition, and then not long ago we were acquired ourselves by Cigna. So when you think about all the disparate data sources that have had to come together different approaches that have had to be aligned, and then also at the same time maintaining the sensitivity of our client data, particularly our health plan clients of Express Scripts, in light of the fact that we are now owned by a health plan Cigna, and maintaining that trust of our health plan clients, of our health services organization, has been absolutely critical. And I think a big part of it has been really coming together as a data and analytics community, and really just learning, first of all, and really learning to understand the systems that each of the different corners of the company are using. How is data stored? What's the data architecture? What's the data engineering approach? And really starting to align on best practices, and really figuring out, you know, if we really want to migrate to one, you know, to the best in class, or if we collectively want to move those data assets or that analytics approach to a new standard that really we as an enterprise will maintain, while still, you know, certainly preserving the firewalls and all of the separation of the data that's so critical to the trust of our clients. And so it's been a journey. We're still early in that journey in many ways. I certainly can't claim that we have it all figured out. But I think really taking an enterprise approach has really helped us all come together, while also maintaining sort of the autonomy to some extent of the individual business units. And again, you know, really maintaining that the firewall preservation, but trying to get the synergies of the enterprise approach is a fine balance. And it's, again, we're still early in the journey, and continuing to improve and find different ways to work together and learn from each other is probably the biggest thing right now, is bringing the collective minds of a lot of really smart data analytics folks, data engineers, data architects, to try to get the best approach for the whole enterprise. Still a lot of learning going on.
It sounds like you're laying a lot of foundation. Luke, I'll kind of follow on with a question, since you are a methodologist expert. So to me, you know, I'm thinking about embedding data professionals into business units, teaching non-data professionals how to use data, the communication aspect. You know, when we meet resistance, what are some of the ways we can overcome that through proper methodology, operating model? What are your ideas there?
Yeah, it sounds a lot like change management. And I think anyone who's in a senior leadership position has read and continues to read about change management. Everyone meets resistance, doesn't matter where you are. When I was in government, I had a small team, but you know, they had to adopt standard protocols. When we switched to a larger company, they have standard protocols. People don't want to innovate based on those. So, you know, things change. So how do you, in general, there's lots of literature obviously on change management, but as I mentioned, we work with a lot of our partners. So we're helping them sort of bring those forward. And I mentioned this idea of privacy engineering and trustworthy systems. That's part of it. Part of it is understanding, obviously it comes a lot from that organization. What are they trying to accomplish? You know, focusing on the outcomes. What are we trying to do here? Why are we trying to do it? I tend to be a bit of a devil's advocate. I always try to play the other side, but I find actually that actually helps sometimes people unlock a little bit, because they get fixated in a certain way of thinking. And then you'll have a senior leader come in and say they want to drive a certain vision. And sometimes you got to play devil's advocate and say, well, what if we didn't do this? You know, what's going to happen to our business, and kind of get people to think in a different way. But coming back to the idea of privacy engineering as well, oftentimes it's just, you know, it's a trust thing, right? People see change as a threat to, you know, how they're currently doing their jobs, their future of their jobs, etc. In some cases, because we tend to deal with a lot of sensitive data, sometimes it's trust in, you know, making sure the access and use of that data is appropriate. Sometimes it can be a red herring, but oftentimes it's also concerns. People have concerns. They have people with, for example, health data, financial data. And so when you start focusing on the benefits and you start framing it certain ways, for example, if you're talking about privacy engineering, we've started using this idea of the 5 safes. So it's a simple framework, but with 5 simple things, you kind of get people to think about those different aspects. So the 5 safes are safe projects, so the legal and ethical issues around the data to make sure that you're using it appropriately. There's safe people. Well, who's going to have access to the data under what circumstances? Healthcare researchers. Why are they going to use the data? Oh, it's for good benefits. You can already see it starts to build a little bit of confidence. What are the settings, the safe settings? Who's going to have access to the data and how? Well, we're going to make sure it's secure. And then safe data. What are the threats to the data? You can look at the classification, the sensitivity we talked about earlier, the level of confidentiality in that data. All those factors play in. And then finally, the safe outputs, which really starts to focus more on what are we trying to do with this data, right? We're going to do it ethically. We're going to drive change. I mean, COVID-19 is a great example of that. I've met so many organizations that are really focused on, they need to drive change right now. There's an urgency to it, which is always good for change management because it really forces things through. But people also understand the value. We're doing this because we're keeping people safe. In the stores, like you mentioned, the idea of how many people can be in the store, how do we set up the store to make sure the flow through is within safe distances, access to health data, how do we get more health data across and help the systems that are currently, under a lot of strain, how do we get pharma data, all that, focusing on those benefits can really help people understand the value here that we're trying to drive. It's not just always about the bottom line. Yes, we need to grow our businesses, but ultimately we need to do it in responsible ways. And I think that, bringing that conversation forward and explaining to people can often really help with that conversation.
I just want to kind of take us maybe in a little bit of a tangent when I think of the introduction of advanced analytics and that being viewed through the lens or eye of people that are working to make decisions in a traditional way. This is a new way of informing decision, right? To be effective, we have to have that proper business understanding and acumen. At the end of the day, we're trying to create new capabilities that are meant to enhance or improve, more importantly, or most importantly, probably enable decision makers and not replace them. There is a little bit of a threat from advanced analytic type capabilities, and that can create some resistance from a culture change perspective. I'm not certain if you guys have experienced this. I have experienced some of it at Express Scripts and at Schnuck's. It really is important to educate folks on the proper use of data and what its purpose is, the proper use of advanced analytics and what its purpose is, so that you can kind of pull or create that culture change, if you will. Joe, as you're working with companies, as you're working within OM1, are you meeting any of that resistance? It sounds like you're a very technically oriented company already. Maybe you're not having that culture resistance that maybe is brought forward from a legacy company experience. Any advice there?
Yes. You're right. As a sort of technology native company, we don't face too many issues with this internally, but in terms of working with external partners and clients, it is a constant process to educate people, as you said, particularly around decision making with respect to data-driven, sort of big data-driven insights generally, and especially 1,000 times more so with respect to artificial intelligence outputs. I think this is more true in healthcare than perhaps in many other fields, because there's such an incumbent culture around how decisions are made, and there's a tremendous amount of importance attached to those decisions because they're changing people's health. So there's an enormous amount of, I think, initial discomfort with suggestions about how to change that decision-making process. And when I work with providers and with health systems, I found a couple things to be really useful in trying to help educate people and help make some of the decisions. But the first thing there is, something very important to us as a company, and a principle we've really adopted, is that when we design artificial intelligence systems in healthcare, they are designed from day one with respect to interpretability, explainability, and applicability to clinical workflows and settings, right? So in other words, I think the big thing that a lot of AI companies run into is they build a really cool black box, but nobody can open it. And that's great in terms of its performance. You know, I'm an analytics person. I love those things. But if you try to show that to a doctor and say, based on this, you should think about advising a patient differently, they'll say, well, tell me why the thing said what it did and why that's different from what, you know, my initial impression may be. And that just doesn't work. That's when you get these things kind of being, you know, nice objects that get left on a shelf. So designing with this intention from the beginning for usability and explainability is really important. And then just constantly, sort of to what Luke was saying, applying and explaining how you're applying your outputs to the questions and problems that people are already trying to solve and to their objectives, whether those are business objectives, care objectives. Just sort of keeping that constant is important as well.
Luke had just made a great point around the black box components of a lot of the machine learning and AI that we're introducing into this domain, which segues a little bit into my next question, which is for Lynne. And it centers on the fact that patients may eventually own their own health information. And what does that mean for organizations currently leveraging sensitive health data for business growth, or to create these new business assets that we were just discussing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That, you know, as we're seeing increased access to data for patients, and certainly the government has been promoting that. There have been recent CMS and ONC final rules come out really mandating more patient access to data. So there's a lot of sensitivity around not only that information flowing and to whom that information can flow, particularly in light of the fact that many of the entities, the third-party applications, mobile apps, those kinds of assets are not necessarily regulated by HIPAA, and in many cases they are not regulated by HIPAA. So there's a business responsibility that we as HIPAA-covered entities have in helping inform our patients that, you know, when they go to have their data brought into, you know, a non-HIPAA secure environment, making sure they're aware of that, and we're helping educate them of the risks of that. Certainly there are benefits to it as well, with patient portability and really being able to use that data in their own care. But we also want to really help them in making it as secure and as safe and private as possible. So from a business asset perspective for us, you know, thinking about how do we leverage that portability of the data? How do we help our patients give us more access to data to help do those analytics, to really identify opportunities in their care, help guide them to, for example, the highest performing providers, to the lowest cost medication or treatment? How do we really help inform them to make better healthcare choices? How do we help work with their physicians to help the physicians and the providers make more data-informed decisions in their healthcare, either for better quality care or lower cost, more effective, more efficient care? So all of those things are really anchors in the clinical programs and solutions that we're creating as business assets. And also, as I mentioned earlier, it's really reflecting the fact that it's the analytics and the insights that will be derived from the data that will truly be the business assets going forward. I think really more than the data itself, because the data really will be flowing so much more freely, and the patients themselves in many cases will really be the owners and the transporters in some cases of that data to and from anyone who's involved in their healthcare.
Do you have concern a patient or someone that owns and the right to be, you know, those types of new regulations and laws pulling their data out of what could be very critical to building a model or establishing insight, or like you said, just ensuring the safety of the individual. That seems to be a concern. Maybe it's not. If you're a covered entity, you have access to that information. I'm a little unclear about that. Is that a concern for Express Scripts?
It's always a concern, although I think really, it's finding that balance of helping enable the patient to have access to their own data, which we are fully supportive of, but it's also trying to protect our own confidential and business sensitive information, but also protecting the safety and security of the patient. And how do we inform them without being a data blocker and without putting up too many barriers for them to get access to their own information, but at the same time help them understand really the risks of, to whom are they sharing their data, and what might happen with that data, particularly if it's not a HIPAA secured, a HIPAA protected entity. And there's just not a lot of data literacy in the lay public to really understand how that data may be used. And from a business sensitivity for us, I think the data that right now is required to be shared is really more about the raw data and the raw data elements tied to that patient's healthcare, as opposed to more the insights and the proprietary business assets that we would be layering on top of that data. But there are questions about that. So if you think about risk scores and certain opportunities and predictive modeling about what we anticipate may be happening to a patient in the future, some of those things may be included in that data that gets shared, and I think there is some potential that could impact some business sensitive analytics as well.
Yeah, I'm hearing both from the prior questions around org and culture, and this one around patient and patient owning their own data. Education is going to be key, right? Communicating our intents, what we're finding, obviously not at the personal level, but what our findings are in these analyses, and presenting them openly is going to help, I think, educate folks on the benefit and value of using their data. One final question. Joe, I'm going to direct this one to you, and it's along the same lines. So the use of sensitive data can make for very sensational headlines. What measures can organizations take to shed light on ways sensitive data is used to serve the best interest of society?
It's a big question, but it's an important one. And I think it does kind of connect to what we were just talking about with respect to organizational understandings of how data are used, as well as consumers, or, in the healthcare industry, patients' understanding of how data are being used. I think that with respect to organizations trying to use data to come up with really insightful and impactful tools, sort of the more insightful and impactful those tools can be, the more there is a potential for things to get sensationalized, especially in some of those environments, as we've been talking about, where there is still a huge lagged need for education and just kind of increased understanding of how all this is being done. I think in terms of making sure that an organization is thinking about those kinds of things appropriately and making sure to not kind of get out over their skis, it's important whenever large conclusions, impactful conclusions are being drawn from data, and especially from analytics, to first of all, make sure that everything has been done correctly along the way, to make sure that data has been used appropriately, it's been appropriately de-identified, confidentiality has been respected. All of, kind of crossing the T's and dotting the I's on those components is crucial. And I also think being very clear about what is and isn't known, and what sort of these conclusions do and don't mean is important as well. I mean, we're all familiar with what happens a lot where, an academic study will come out about, chocolate has a 2%, chance of improving your cardiovascular outcomes under a billion different conditions. And that turns into a headline in the news that's like, everybody go eat chocolate because it's great for your health, right? And so there's this simplification that happens. Sometimes perhaps it's good, sometimes it's bad, but just thinking through how that especially media simplification process will handle and transform whatever it is that your company is discovering and putting out into the world, and kind of thinking about that in advance, I think is really important, so that you don't end up with a situation where everybody is attributing an insight or a pattern to you that is not actually what you found, and not even in what you said, but is just kind of the result of this process of how information gets out into the world.
Yeah, I think you said something very important at the beginning around ethical use of data, not violating the trust of the individuals we're attempting to serve. Okay, well, panelists, we're out of time. I want to thank you for your time and answering these questions. I'll ask if you have any final thoughts, starting with Luke.
Oh, geez. Sure. I actually wanted to build on something that Joe was saying, because it's really important when he talked about AI and explainability. That's a great example, actually, of showing the world, so to speak, how these tools are being used. I used to work for a data protection authority, and there was a lot of concern around the use of AI, and everyone sees it as a threat in many different ways, not just a threat to how we live our lives and how we're working, but also in terms of how it's being used. And having a system, as he was describing it, is so critical that not only obviously the doctors using it have to know that they can trust it, but I think society as a whole needs to understand how these tools are being developed and used as well. They're being used for very specific things. In the privacy space, you talk about purpose specification. People have this idea of Skynet. These things are going to just take over the world, but they're being built for very specific uses. They're being built for, could be financial, or it could be, in the case of Joe was describing, of a healthcare system, right? And I think that's part of this whole conversation, to me, really revolves around trust. And these new tools, they raise a lot of threats, a lot of concerns, and being able to be transparent and say, look, this is how these tools are being used. I think that's really helpful to adding to that social trust and social license to actually use this data in innovative ways.
All right, thank you. Lynne, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just build on that a little bit, in that I think, we've a strong current through the entire conversation today has been around trust. And I think, one of the things that I certainly have found in working really at the intersection of the business and the data assets that we have, is a lot of the trust comes with understanding and the transparency of what we're doing with the data and how that's being done and for what purpose is that being done. So to the point about the black boxes, and there's just that inherent skepticism when people don't understand how AI even works, how machine learning works, how predictive modeling works. And so building that data acumen within not only our business partners, but also even with the lay public, with our doctors, with our patients, and really helping drive an understanding of how these analytics work. And I think that can go a long way to building that trust and just having that transparent, conversation around what we're doing and what the purpose of the analytics is, I think goes a long way to build that trust as well.
Great. Joe?
Yeah, I would just echo exactly what everyone else has said here. And I would put maybe a final optimistic spin on it, which is to say that if we are able to continue using data assets appropriately, respectfully, and transparently, there truly is enormous potential to take what's already being generated out there in terms of people's lived experiences and really improve in healthcare, to improve outcomes for lots and lots of people. So it's an exciting time.
All right, great. Yeah, I hear as a thread through this huge opportunity and potential, but in order to really capitalize on that, we have to educate. And we use CDOIQ, I think, last year at this forum quite often. Increase the data IQ of those people that we're attempting to either support with these new types of insights and analytics, or inform the decisions that are being made by individuals using these types of insights and analytics. When we do that education, when we increase the data acumen of individuals, hopefully that trust will be developed. So thank you.